When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, a facial reconstruction expert is required to help try and find the identity of a murder victim.
A facial depiction is not the same as a portrait, but when it's finished, we get a real sense of who the individual was. That, hopefully, is what will lead to her identification.
And in Northern Ireland, an expert witness is brought in to try and place suspects at the scene of a crime by analysing their mobile phone data.
The murder took place at 1447, so that's placing all of those phones for all of our suspects in the area of the scene of the offence, very close to the time that the offence took place.
Forensic facial reconstruction is the prediction of facial appearance from skeletal analysis in the hope that someone will recognise them and then they will be identified.
June 2013, Edinburgh, Scotland. The imposing castle sits proudly on the hill for all to see, but in a nature reserve just minutes away, a grim secret lies beneath the ground.
This is a nature reserve in central Edinburgh, just minutes away from one of Edinburgh's busiest roads.
BBC journalist Katrina Renton reported daily on a story that took over the country's front pages.
On the 6th of June, a cyclist found human remains on Corstorphine Hill.
He said it was a fine day and he'd decided to have a rest in a clearing that he'd spotted. But he said almost instantly the first thing he noticed were very white teeth. And he said he realised what he was looking at were a skull and teeth.
Retired Superintendent Scott Cunningham ran a team of over 50 officers for what was classed as a Category A homicide case.
There was an immediate local response. It was an overgrown area, and it looked like there was a person's head or a skull and quite prominent teeth. Clearly, they were human remains. So there was that immediate containment of the area to preserve the scene.
It was a major murder inquiry for police in Edinburgh. A woman's remains discovered, her torso and severed head and legs buried in a shallow grave.
This was a huge public interest. This woman had been found in such unusual and distressing circumstances. People wanted to know who she was, why she was killed, and why she'd been left where she was.
Initially, the priority was to obtain a DNA sample and check if the person was known across the missing person database across the UK and the national DNA database as well. But unfortunately, there was no trace of the DNA on either.
With no DNA match, police and a team of forensic experts had to find another way to identify the victim.
There were distinctive clues with this body. There were rings attached to the lady's fingers, a daisy ring and an Irish cladder ring. And there was a huge search. There was appeal after appeal after appeal, and still nobody was found.
There was nothing to suggest who the person was. We didn't know anything at all that would lead us to progress our investigation. So we sought the assistance of a number of experts to look at the forensic examinations of the human remains.
First, they turned to one of the fastest developing areas of forensic investigation, facial reconstruction. Professor Caroline Wilkinson of Liverpool's John Moores University is the UK's leading expert.
The police delivered to us CT scans of the human remains, and then we could produce a 3D model of the skull of the individual from which we could produce a facial reconstruction.
This high-definition image offered vital clues to help Caroline begin her work.
This is really good quality information. We're getting a lot of detail about the surface of the bone. We're also getting a little bit about the position of the neck. We can see a lot of detail about her nasal bones, which are very small, so we often lose those. And we can see her distinctive profile with this slightly more prominent upper teeth than lower teeth. The next step is to import each of the muscles of the face and alter them to fit this skull. And we have a database of pre-modelled muscles that we can import one by one. And then we can make small alterations in terms of scale or in terms of small changes in shape by pulling and pushing the muscle with these tools that we have in our 3D system. And we have a series of tissue depth pegs that we place over the surface of the skull that tell us the average amount of soft tissue for someone of her ethnic background, gender and age. So once we have all the muscles in place, we can then look to determining some of the facial features. So we can bring in things like, you can see here a neck that we can bring in, and we need to attach that in the correct position on the base of the skull. We then can bring in a nose that's determined by the measurements and assessments that we make of the nasal aperture. We can predict the shape of the lips from looking at the shape of the teeth. And then the final part of this whole process is to add a skin layer over the top of that, building the surface of the skin over the muscles, but the shape of that skin is determined by the muscle structure. We've deliberately chosen to leave her with a slightly open mouth so that you can see her upper teeth. Because her teeth are characteristic and may be important for recognition, then we wanted to highlight that in the depiction.
While Dr. Wilkinson worked on reconstructing the victim's distinct smile, police asked whether her teeth might offer further clues, so turned to another area of forensic science.
It was clear that the person had received some cosmetic dental work, so we sought the assistance of an expert forensic odontologist, Dr. Douglas Sheasby.
Forensic odontology is that branch of forensic medicine and science that deals with administration of criminal justice with the involvement of dental evidence. I attended the mortuary in Edinburgh and examined the victim's mouth. The upper jaw had been restored completely with advanced crown and bridge work and implants, dental implants. The lower jaw was untreated. This is not a common dental finding. Advanced restorative treatment for half the mouth and simply no treatment in the other half of the mouth, and that's a significant observation.
Hoping this unique dental work would be easily recognised, Detective Cunningham circulated Dr. Sheasby's findings among dentists in the UK.
We were very hopeful we would identify who the person was from that line of inquiry. However, we weren't able to at that time.
No UK dentist recognised the work. With hopes of a dental identification dashed, police were now relying on Dr. Wilkinson's facial reconstruction more than ever, just as she was beginning the final phase.
That's not a great image to put out to the public. It's not very recognisable as a person. So what we do now is we take a still image from the front, and then we add what we call textures, which are photographic images of parts of faces to combine them to make a composite face that we can then put out to the public.
Using a database of facial features, Caroline builds the face so it looks more like a photograph.
We want to choose the features that are most representative of the reconstruction. We can then open the one that we choose, and then we can position in the correct place. You can see the all-important mouth with the teeth visible. We've blurred some of those external features, such as her hair and ears, because those are the areas of the face that we're less certain of. The areas where we have most confidence are the central part of the face, where the eyes, nose and mouth, and that's where the focus of this image is to help with recognition. We know that a facial depiction like this is not the same as a portrait, but when it's finished like this, we get a real sense of who the individual was, and that hopefully is what people will recognise and then lead to her identification.
After a month of this being a mystery as to who this person was, the facial reconstruction was released by the police. It was on the front page of the newspaper, and it gave a human identity to the body that had been discovered and a chance that somebody was going to be able to identify her.
Officers now have over 30 possible names for this woman, leads they have to investigate after her image was released yesterday. Operation Sandpiper's inquiry team are now following up these calls from as far away as Israel. But still they await the breakthrough they desperately need.
While detectives waited for a decisive call from the public, they next considered one of the distinctive rings the victim was wearing.
The ring pointed to perhaps Ireland, the Claddagh ring. And so the picture was distributed to the Republic of Ireland, and that turned out to be where the answers were found.
Good afternoon, Operation Sandpipers.
A woman contacted the police to suggest that it may be her aunt. And there was a call later the same day from James Dunleavy, who was reporting that his mother, Philomena, or Phyllis as she was known, had been staying with him in Edinburgh and had then left at the beginning of May. Now that we had a name, there was a key opportunity to identify who the person was, and we sought the assistance from Dr. Sheesby.
Dental records from a dental practice in Dublin were obtained, and I compared these records with the dental charting that we'd created as a result of our various examinations. The crucial point of the identification is that the highly specific treatment corresponds exactly with the records that had been noted by the Dublin dentist. And it was on that basis that we were able to confirm the identity, the dental identity of this victim.
Detectives finally had a confirmed identification for the victim. 66-year-old Phyllis Dunleavy from Dublin had last been seen 2 months ago. Her son James, also known as Seamus, was living in Edinburgh.
Well, this meant that the police could start their investigation in earnest, and it took them back to Corstorphine, of course, close to where her body had been found, and they were able to talk to local people, to do door-to-door searches, and ultimately interview her son.
James told us his mum had visited him and had left unannounced at the beginning of May without his knowledge or awareness. And as far as we knew, he was the last person to see Phyllis alive.
As police investigated, James Dunleavy, a close friend of his, came forward and said at the time of Phyllis's visit, James had fallen out with her. And when the friend tried to visit his flat, James refused entry, claiming his mother was sleeping.
On the back of that, we spoke to local residents, and one provided information that they'd seen James discarding items believed to be from his flat, which was significant.
Investigators suspected James Dunleavy's flat could be a crime scene and needed to act quickly.
It was a detailed forensic examination over a number of days, but what we identified was that James had attempted to clear up the flat and dispose of items within the flat, all with a view to hide any forensic trace of Phyllis.
After their forensic examination, detectives suspected that James Dunleavy had murdered his mother there and dismembered her before taking her body parts to the clearing in Corstorphine Hill.
The decision was made that there was a sufficiency of evidence to detain and bring him into police custody on suspicion of the murder of his mother.
In January 2014, the case went to trial at the High Court, where James Dunleavy pleaded not guilty.
The High Court heard that Seamus Dunleavy had told friends that he'd heard voices in his head, that he might be evil, that he'd done something bad. Prosecutors said the case against him was circumstantial, but the evidence came together like the strands of a cable.
The judge ordered a psychiatric assessment of James Dunleavy before handing down a 9-year sentence.
James Dunleavy was found guilty of culpable homicide, which was due to diminished responsibility, so it's a lesser charge of murder.
Discovering the truth about Phyllis's death was all made possible by the expert work undertaken by doctors Sheasby and Wilkinson.
When people get identified, it gives value to the work that we do. Every time it helps in an investigation, we're really pleased with the results. There's an added benefit when that also leads to a conviction for murder, because that helps the whole investigation, not just the identification of the victim.
There is absolutely no doubt that Professor Caroline Wilkinson's work enabled us to identify Phyllis, enabled us to progress the investigation and ultimately find out what had happened to her.
In this case, the murderer was convicted relatively quickly following the investigation, so it was a good result.
Cell site analysis is where we take call data records for mobile phone numbers, and by looking at where those cell masts and cell IDs are located and the area in which they provide coverage, we can give an indication of the location of the phone at the time that that activity took place.
May 2019, Bangor, Northern Ireland.
It was in the car park of Sainsbury's supermarket on Sunday afternoon that the 35-year-old was shot dead in front of his 3-year-old son. The police believe more than one person was involved. Colin Horner was shot at close range. He died a short time later.
Court reporter Ashley MacDonald covered the case.
Colin Horner was doing what a lot of fathers would do on a bank holiday weekend. He was out shopping with his son, and he was putting his child into the back of the car when a masked man dressed all in black ran up to him and shot him 5 times at close blank range. There was 5 shots fired at him in total, and the post-mortem suggested that the first bullet that was fired into his thigh, which would have rendered him to fall to the ground. Now, not content with this, the gunman continued to keep shooting at him, and all of this was done in full view of a 3-year-old boy.
Colin's mum Leslie was 20 miles away in Belfast when she heard the news.
So all I remember after that is screaming, falling down on the floor. And I remember running outside, screaming outside, and just all hell broke loose. So then after that, it was just, my world just collapsed. Colin was wonderful. He was wonderful. Everybody just loved him. He walked in the room lit up. You know, he always was carrying on, joking about, he always had a bit of crack, you know. We used to call him Del Boy, do you know, because he always knew somebody. If you need this fixed, if you need that fixed, you need a bit of decorating done, he always knew somebody would help somebody out, you know, or he would do it himself. He was a character, absolute character. And he lived for his wee ones, he just lived for his kids.
But Colin also had connections with violent, loyalist gangs.
He got involved with paramilitaries as a young lad, as a teenager. And I had told him, you know, please never get involved.
Colin did try to break away from the paramilitaries.
He says, I'm having nothing more to do with them. They're ruining my life, he says. They're just torturing the life out of me. And because he wasn't doing what he was asked to do or told to do, that's obviously where this all stemmed from.
Detectives investigating Colin's murder now discovered that he was receiving death threats from the gang and even received one in the days before he was murdered.
The police actually said to me, he's got another death threat, and I said, oh no. And I said, the policeman, look, is that serious? He says, yes, it is serious.
Detectives were left convinced Colin had been killed by loyalist paramilitaries.
Colin Horner could be the latest victim in an ongoing UDA feud. The 35-year-old was shot in this Sainsbury's car park, which was busy with shoppers yesterday afternoon. Flowers have been left close to the spot where he was killed.
Following this attack, the police automatically viewed CCTV from in and around that car park, and 2 cars roused immediate suspicion. A maroon Ford Mondeo, which was found burnt out a short distance from the murder scene, and a second vehicle, a black Ford Focus. Police believed that this Focus was used as a surveillance vehicle. It had been seen tailing Colin. It had been seen outside his house in the hours before his murder, and this formed a huge basis of the CCTV investigation. These 2 vehicles were found, seized and examined, and some very, very crucial DNA evidence was born from the searches of these vehicles. DNA was able to be gleaned from one of the seat belts. There were discarded cans and bottles, and there was also a cigarette butt left at the scene.
The DNA evidence led the police to 4 suspects: Alan Wilson, Joseph Blair, Robert Ralph, and Ryan Smith. But there was a problem. Although DNA proved that the men were in the cars at some point, it didn't prove they were there when Colin was murdered. To try and prove that, detectives turned to cell site analyst Paul Hope.
As you're driving round, you'll see big cell site masts with a load of white plates on the top. And those white plates are the cell IDs. When you make a call, your phone transmits whatever you're doing to a cell ID, which then takes it into the network.
Mobile networks keep records of what phones connect to which cell IDs and when. By deciphering these records, Paul is able to prove where a phone is located at any given time. Now, detectives hoped he could discover evidence to place Colin's killers at the scene of the crime.
We're quite lucky in this case because the victim's phone and all of the suspect phones were all using the O2 network. That meant that I got DDR data, which are device data records. And DDR events take place all the time without the user's knowledge.
Device data records show which cell ID a mobile phone is connected to and when. This allows Paul to accurately plot the location and movements of the mobile.
So if we look at this period here, which is around 1447 on the 28th, if I, for example, just highlight all of the phones that are involved, I can then send that to the master map. If you look at the point where the victim's phone moves north from his home address to Sainsbury's, the suspect's phones mirror that movement, and they mirror that movement all the way to Sainsbury's. We know that the offence or the murder took place at 1447, so that's placing all of those phones for all of our suspects in the area of the scene of the offence, very close to the time that the offence took place.
But Paul needed more, so he travelled to Northern Ireland to conduct what's known as a radio frequency survey at the scene of the crime and along what police believe was the getaway route.
So what we do is we go out with our forensic equipment and we do radio frequency propagation surveys by setting up the equipment to record certain frequencies on certain networks, on certain technologies. We can gather all of the serving cell IDs and neighbouring cell IDs around the vicinity of a set location. With the Colin Horner case, we have certain significant locations. We've got Sainsbury's car park, which is the scene, we've got the victim's home address, and we've got the vehicle dump site. All of those would need to be surveyed, and all of those, because of the case that we're dealing with, would be surveyed on O2. What we would do is we would get the kit, set it running as we have done today, and we would drive around each of those locations as slowly as possible in order to pick up as many measurements as we possibly could.
Paul analysed the RF survey results and compared it to the call data.
All of the suspects' phones appeared to plot around the victim's home address during the day. They all moved at the same time in a mirrored movement as the victim's phone when the victim moved from his home address to Sainsbury's, and they were all located in an area that includes Sainsbury's at the time the murder took place. Having committed the murder, all of the suspects' phones moved south with one of the offending vehicles and were also located where that vehicle was eventually dumped.
This compelling evidence of the suspect's movements, along with the CCTV footage and DNA from the car, formed a strong case against the four men. In January 2019, they appeared in court charged with murder. They ended up pleading guilty and were handed down automatic life sentences.
Nothing's going to bring him back. Nothing to bring him back. So we have a life sentence, but at least they're away for a very long time.
When I look now back at the evidence, I think it was quite impactful. It showed the movements of the phones quite accurately, but I think the most impactful part was the fact that it mirrored the movement of the victim's phone from his home address to the scene, and then that all of the offending phones at the time of the murder were using cells that I'd found providing coverage at Sainsbury's using the RF equipment. And obviously, as a result of my report, the suspect subsequently pleaded guilty.
The fact that the forensics were able to track them down through their phones, and it just amazes me. They're the unsung heroes, the people you don't see, you know, they really are. So absolutely amazing. Amazing.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, an expert witness examines a muddy crime scene to determine how a body got there.
He was standing up, straight up, and he was just bent at the waist. That in itself is interesting.
And when police investigate a number of complaints against the young man,
my gut instinct did say that there was something up with him, something wrong, but unfortunately I ignored my gut instinct and lived to regret that.
a virologist is brought in to reveal if the suspect was guilty.
Where you have a transmission, you can see a resemblance between the strains infecting the two parties, and it was really that type of linkage that would substantiate the allegations that were made.
Forensic bioarchaeology can help criminal investigation by interpreting the crime scene. Sometimes the environment can give as much evidence as the body itself, sometimes more.
June 2018, Gosmore in Hertfordshire. 69-year-old farmer Bill Taylor is reported missing from his home by his family. Reporting on the case for the national newspapers at the time was Thomas Hornell.
Gosmore is a small hamlet, and most of the farmland there was actually owned by the Taylors. There was hundreds of acres. Dozens of police ended up showing up and combing through every blade of grass on Bill's farmland, searching for him. So this was a really big police presence for a normally sleepy town.
Due to the sheer scale and complexity of the search, the Hertfordshire Police Major Crime Unit were called in to organise the hunt for Bill.
This was certainly the largest search that I've ever been involved in and coordinated.
While search teams scoured the countryside, Detective Chief Inspector Carl Foster turned to Bill's family and friends. They revealed his personal life was complicated. Estranged from his second wife Angela, and with his family at war.
Whilst Bill and Angela were separated, they weren't yet divorced. Angela wanted to get divorced. Bill was effectively digging his heels in and saying, no, I don't want to do that.
Both Bill and Angela had children from previous marriages, and they had 3 children together. And in particular, Bill's son from his first marriage did not get on with Angela and her side of the family at all. In fact, they completely loathed each other.
Bill was kind of stuck in the middle because Bill obviously loved both sides of the family. He had children and grandchildren in both sides of the family, and he was stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Although police had no body with which to reveal a definitive cause of death, they began to suspect foul play from within the feuding family.
The police were suspicious of Angela because she didn't seem that moved or distressed by Bill's disappearance, and detectives also overheard her talking about him in the past tense.
However, detectives could not identify an obvious motive for why Angela would have wanted her husband dead.
There was already a post-nuptial agreement in place between Bill and Angela, where they'd already agreed on the allocation of property and land worth anything from 150 to 200 million pounds. The title deeds had already been moved over to Angela as part of that agreement, so that effectively, for me, said, well, there can't be a financial motive here then.
But one discovery left detectives convinced someone in Bill's circle held a serious grudge against him.
One of the issues that concerned us was the fact that his vehicle had been subject to an arson attack the week prior to him going missing. It had been attended by officers and a scenes of crime officer. The towel, the shirt and the fuel can that were found in the Land Rover didn't belong to Bill. We sent all of those off for forensic examination to establish whether there was any forensic evidence that would assist us.
Detectives continued their investigations, this time into Angela's personal life, and identified someone who raised their suspicions.
The police began to look at a man named Paul Cannon, who was a digger driver who had done some work on Bill's farm and was around a lot at Angela's place. So they really began to look at those two, suspecting a relationship.
Angela admitted she was having an affair with Paul Cannon. And when lab results returned from the items in the burnt-out Land Rover, they showed traces of Cannon's DNA. Significant, but not enough to prove he was responsible for Bill's disappearance.
What the forensic evidence against Paul Cannon did was obviously elevate our concerns around what was going on between him and Bill, and potentially Angela, and that whole family dynamic. But on its own, does it explain what has then happened to Bill a week later? No, it doesn't.
Nonetheless, Hertfordshire Police declared the case a murder inquiry. Without a body, they didn't have enough evidence to charge either Angela Taylor or Paul Cannon of any wrongdoing. But their investigation was far from over.
We became aware that Paul Cannon had been employed at 2 quarry sites, both within the county of Hertfordshire. Whilst the 2 sites had been shut down, if Bill has been murdered, could his body have been secreted in either one of those quarries?
Any disused quarry is a hazardous environment. These 2 were huge. Concerned about the risk to police search teams, Carl turned to bioarchaeologist Jennifer Miller for advice.
I have a lot of experience of searching landfill for missing person and recovery of bodies buried within landfill. So I was asked to advise what the logistics would be for recovery of anything from this sort of environment. We walked over the quarries and they're both over an acre. There's between 20 and 30 metres high mounds of industrial waste, and it's very, very unstable, very, very dangerous, potential for collapse, and it would have taken months, if not years, to search it all. And without substantiated evidence to say that he was in there, then it's not worth doing.
DCI Carl Foster took Jenny's advice and decided against excavating the quarry. Searching for more concrete evidence that Bill was murdered, he examined mobile phones belonging to Paul Cannon and Angela Taylor. They contained 28,000 text messages sent between the pair in the 4 months before Bill's disappearance. The content was shocking.
So this is just a small extract from the thousands of messages between Paul Cannon and Angela Taylor. It starts with Paul Cannon, "Got to get him out of the picture very soon, darling." And she replies, "I don't know how to sort it, someone else maybe." And Paul Cannon replies to the effect, "I only know one man for that and I haven't spoken to him in a long time, but I'll try." The following day, the 17th of February, "You phone that bloke, can't keep going on like this." And Cannon replies, "I'm good, darling, just spoke to man, going to be about 20. To which she replies, "I'll go halves with you."
Messages closer to the time of Bill's disappearance were even more chilling.
26th of May was the night Bill's Land Rover was subject to the arson attack. And you've got a conversation here where Paul says, "Have to go to Dog Kennel, get something." The Dog Kennel is the name of one of the farms that Angela owned. Angela replies, "What you got to get?" And then Paul Cannon replies, "Darling, you light my fire."
But both Paul Cannon and Angela Taylor refused to make any comment on the significance of these text messages.
Why did you make the comment, "light my fire"? Or does he say it to you?
No comment.
Because neither of you have said it to each other ever before. Can't be a coincidence that night the Land Rover gets set on fire, can it?
No comment.
Bill was last seen alive around 9:30 by his grandson. And then some 2 hours later, Paul Cannon sends a message to Angela Taylor saying, "Just watching Kill Bill 2, laugh out loud," which is pretty sinister when you know the timeline and the sequence of events. And then you read that message.
The messages also contained violent sexual fantasies centered around punishing Bill. But tellingly, they all stopped the day Bill disappeared.
There's no more talk of, getting rid of Bill, killing Bill, making love while the blood's running down the drain. None of that. Why is that?
No.
Why has it stopped on the 4th of June?
No. The recovery of these messages was a huge leap forward in the investigation. I would describe those messages as a black and white transcript of a conspiracy to murder Bill.
Angela Taylor and Paul Cannon were both charged with murder. But Bill's body was yet to be found. The case against the pair was far from watertight.
We were preparing for the no-body trial. The defence would exploit that and suggest that he's potentially taken himself off, he might have a girlfriend somewhere, he's had enough and he's walked out of his life.
Then, in February 2019, 8 months after Bill Taylor disappeared, a chance discovery gave detectives a massive breakthrough.
Bill's remains were found by a fisherman who wanted to get the perfect spot, so he'd actually gone onto private land owned by Angela and discovered the remains of Bill Taylor by the riverbank.
The body offered detectives an entirely new set of clues which could reveal for the first time how Bill Taylor died.
We knew we were going to need to demonstrate that Bill hadn't gone there to take his own life, and he hadn't gone there and been victim of some form of medical episode or accident.
DCI Carl Foster needed a thorough forensic analysis of the body and the riverbank where it was found. So he turned again to expert witness Jennifer Miller.
My remit was primarily to recover the body and interpret events at the scene, so how the body had got into the river as best as possible. The mud was just short of 1 metre deep. All you could see was the head just at the banking and the back, which was covered in algae, and there was nothing else visible. So it was face down in the mud. The first thing to do is try to understand how the body is lying, so the disposition of the remains, as it's called. And we were able to identify quite quickly that although he was lying face down, he was actually standing up and he was just bent at the waist. So that in itself is interesting. It's an unusual way to be in.
This unusual position made Jennifer doubt that Bill had become stuck in the deep mud on his own.
The positioning of the body was such that both feet were facing the bank. It would be very difficult to walk in backwards through that thick mud without losing your balance and falling backwards rather than forwards, and perhaps that's the key point. As you lift your leg to go forwards, you're more likely to overbalance backwards than you are forwards. It's more suggestive of being laid there, being put over somebody's shoulder and with the feet facing forwards and deposited.
What's more, Jennifer concluded Bill may well have already been dead by the time he was placed in the river.
I think it's unlikely that he was put in there alive and effectively kicking, because he didn't kick. The feet were together, the knees were together, his thighs were together. He was bolt upright, and it's very unlikely, in my opinion, that he was conscious when this happened.
Under Jennifer's supervision, Bill's body was carefully recovered from the mud and sent for post-mortem. That revealed injuries to his neck consistent with strangulation. The case against Angela Taylor and Paul Cannon was now as strong as it could be. Their trial began in September 2019, and Jennifer's evidence was crucial.
At the trial, the defence were quite robust in their questioning. They insisted that he had potentially walked in and asked me to say if this was possible. And I did explain to them that having never taken a body into the mire, I don't know. But I'm quite convinced, in my own opinion, that had he walked into the mire, then the disposition of the remains would have been very different.
Jen was really important around the interpretation of that deposition site. Her evidence was absolutely solid and, yeah, couldn't ask for more, really.
They talked of torturing him in text messages, discussed the cost of hiring a hitman, and today they were found guilty of his murder. A jury has decided that wealthy farmer Bill Taylor was killed by his wife and her lover for refusing her a divorce.
Duplicitous and calculating and plainly besotted. That was the judge's assessment today of lovers Angela Taylor and Paul Cannon, as they were each sentenced to 21 years in prison for the murder of William Taylor.
What a pointless exercise. The old-fashioned, like just removing a love rifle. But it just seems so unnecessary, you know, to murder an old man who is causing them no problem whatsoever. Yeah, real shame.
My main interest has been in the field of the evolution of viruses, how they change over time, and I think that's obviously something that we're all very aware of with the COVID pandemic.
Edinburgh 2015, where a shocking crime is unfolding, one that will span the UK, affect dozens of gay men, and end in a dramatic national manhunt. It started with one man, 26-year-old Darryl Rowe, and one of his victims, Stuart Roger.
I came across Darryl Rowe through an app called Grindr, which is a sort of dating hookup app, a bit akin to Tinder. I agreed to meet up with Darryl, and during that encounter, he appeared to tamper or sabotage the condom, which I had insisted on being used. And at the time, I just wrote it off as me over-worrying about something. I kind of felt quite grotty after the encounter with Darryl, and, you know, the truth was there was a very dark atmosphere around him, which was unmistakable. My gut instinct did say that there was something up with him and that there was something wrong, but unfortunately I ignored my gut instinct and lived to regret that.
Stuart's instinct that something was wrong was confirmed within days when he received a string of sinister text messages from Rowe.
About 8 days later, after the encounter, he sent me a series of abusive messages, revealing to me that he had indeed sabotaged the condom, along with a series of other insults and taunts. I felt an enormous sense of alarm and disturbance when I got those messages. And I knew that because he had sabotaged the condom, I was at risk of contracting something. So I arranged a HIV test as soon as I possibly could. A couple of weeks after that, I sadly got the phone call from the clinic asking me to come in that day and telling me that I was HIV positive, and I knew that it was definitely him. I did contact the police, I think, within about a week of my diagnosis. You know, I was determined to get justice, and I gave a full statement about what had happened, told them that this man had violated my consent and showed them the screen grabs of the messages that he had sent me.
Police Scotland moved to arrest Darryl Rowe, but he had fled. Detectives searched for him and were astonished when he turned up 500 miles away in Brighton. Here he was deliberately infecting more men with HIV. BBC journalist Carol Erskine reported on the case.
In Brighton, another one of his victims had found out he had tested positive for HIV. He had gone to a clinic to be tested, and while he was there, he had shown text messages that Darryl Rowe had sent him, these terrible, horrible messages that he'd sent him to staff at the clinic. And they then realised that they had seen other men in the clinic who'd had similar messages.
Police now suspected they were dealing with a serial offender who had left behind 14 victims in Edinburgh and now 8 new victims in Brighton. Sussex police caught up with Darryl Rowe and he was arrested on a charge of GBH. But Rowe denied all the charges, and under questioning, he claimed he was not even HIV positive.
Do you have HIV?
No.
Have you had a HIV test recently?
Not recently. I had a relationship when I first got here, and it was unprotected.
Mm-hmm.
So I've not been tested after that.
Okay. So what you're saying is a couple of months ago, you had a relationship, had unprotected sex.
When I first got here,
When you first got to Sussex?
I was dating somebody pretty quickly. It got quite intense.
Darryl Rowe was bailed in Brighton to return to his foster parents in Scotland. It was after 3 weeks of living with them that he went on the run and was missing.
Detectives were convinced Rowe would offend again. They shared his image with the media, and a national manhunt swung into action.
Police found his tent in the Pentland Hills, and they were able to identify it as being his because it had his medication inside.
But for months, there was no sign of Rowe, until one man saw Roe's image and had a chilling realisation.
He was living in Newcastle with a man who believed he was in a relationship with him and had no idea of his previous history.
Roe had changed his name and bank details, but continued with his prolific crime spree, infecting even more victims with HIV.
The nationwide manhunt to find him uncovered further victims, and he was actually discovered on a dating website when police were able to compare pictures of his genitalia and discover that this is the man that they were looking for.
After a joint operation by Northumbria, Scotland and Sussex police forces, Roe was finally arrested in North Tyneside. But he claimed that his accusers could have caught HIV from anyone. Detectives needed to prove that the infection could only have come from Roe. So they turned to an expert witness, Peter Simmons, Professor of Virology at the University of Oxford.
We were provided with blood samples from Roe and several alleged victims of him. We separated white cells from those. Within white cells, there'll be copies of HIV, often very low numbers, but we will then amplify those up to an extent which means we can then directly determine their genetic sequence and analyse them for linkage. HIV evolves very quickly, so it's not just one strain. There are literally hundreds of thousands of different strains. Where you have a transmission of HIV, then you can see a resemblance between the strains infecting the two parties. And it was really that type of linkage that we're looking for to substantiate the allegations that were made. We conduct what we call phylogenetic analysis that will show whether these strains cluster together or whether they're unrelated to each other. Well, if we find a strong clustering of strains, and in fact, in this case we did, what this shows effectively is they share a similar or common strain of HIV, and that would generally be acquired through transmission between them.
Having concluded a strain of HIV was common among Roe and his victims, Professor Simmons now had to recheck his results and run the analysis a second time.
We were provided with a second set of samples, and the idea of that was to show that we reproducibly got the same strains from the individuals in a different set of samples. That was actually what the defence expert would demand that we provide as evidence.
In 2018, Davil Roe was tried at courts in both England and Scotland. He was charged with causing grievous bodily harm with intent to infect HIV. He became the first man in the country to be found guilty of intentionally trying to spread the virus.
When we were in court, I saw him in the flesh for the first time since the incident, and that was very nerve-wracking. It was kind of a vindication to see him, cut down to size, and he was a much more belittled and humble figure sitting there in the dock.
I went to court and had to testify to the judge and jury. Finding such a strong cluster in such a large number of people was actually key to the certainty that Roe was involved in this, and I think the genetic evidence was very well understood by the jury and probably influenced their decision that he was guilty.
Roe was sentenced to 12 years in England, and in Scotland, he was given 8 years and placed on the sex offenders register.
I felt a huge amount of relief, most of all. Sadly, a lot of victims of sexual violence don't get justice, and I was very lucky in that respect. And actually, that's a credit to the professionalism of everybody involved on the case. Peter Simmons' work was crucial in convicting Darryl because it helped us get to the point where it could be proved beyond reasonable doubt that it had been transmitted from him to me.
Without the virology findings, the prosecution would rely on the fact that there was a consistent contact history between Roe and the individuals concerned. So having the genetic evidence was certainly very important in showing the linkage between HIV strains within the various parties involved.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, can a forensic scientist link the death of a young student to a serial sex offender?
This wasn't expected. This could be that key breakthrough in the case that we were hoping for.
And when a man is found murdered in his own home, detectives turn to an unusual specialism to crack the case: the science of soil.
This particular area had recently been disturbed.
My specialism is biological trace evidence, and that's really quite wide-ranging. So that could be a body fluid or targeting particular areas where we think someone may have touched.
January 2019, Kingston upon Hull. 21-year-old Libby Squire is reported missing. Journalist Jack Hardy reported on the case.
Libby Squire was on a night out with her friends from the University of Hull. They had gone down to the Welly nightclub. It had become obvious to her friends on the walk that she was heavily inebriated and that she was turned away for being too drunk by a doorman. Her friends placed her in a taxi and sent her back to where her home was on Wellesley Avenue. The taxi driver saw her get out and wander in the direction of her home, and everybody thought that basically things were okay. But the problem was that Libby did not go back to her home.
Libby's mum, Lisa, was working the night shift when Libby's friends raised the alarm.
I think the arrangement was that she was going to message them when she got home, and she hadn't messaged. By 12:30, when she hadn't messaged, they left the club and walked home, and obviously then discovered she wasn't there. So they called me and said, we can't find her. And that was the start of how I discovered that she was missing. Libby was a very lively character. She was full of fun. All of her friends say, you know, the party started when Libby arrived. She was very, very caring, she was very sensitive. Her and I were incredibly close. Yeah, she was, you know, we spoke every day. So I rang my husband and said, I think we've got a problem. I can't find Libby. He was like, oh, she's probably just stayed at somebody's house. And I'm like, but she hasn't called me. And if ever Libby was in trouble or was upset, she would phone me. And she hadn't phoned. So I knew something was seriously wrong from that point.
Humberside Police launched the biggest missing person investigation they'd ever undertake. It involved more than 100 officers and 50 different specialist search assets, as they described them. They drafted in help from various surrounding forces, and they were using drones, they were using helicopters, they were using specialist dive teams to try and find any trace they could of Libby.
Detectives began trawling CCTV footage from the night Libby went missing.
There were two key pieces of CCTV which appeared to show the silhouette of a slight figure being placed into the passenger seat of a car, and then appeared to show a kind of distant commotion between two figures before the car driving off.
This car now led detectives to their first suspect.
Through trawling hours and hours of CCTV, police were eventually able to find the licence plate for this silver Vauxhall Astra and trace it back to Pavel Relevich and his home nearby on Reglan Street.
24-year-old Relevich was originally from Poland and was working in Hull as a butcher.
He was married, he had 2 children, the youngest of whom was only 3 months at the time. Outwardly facing, he looked exactly like a family man, so police had no reason to suspect him.
But as detectives questioned Relevich, they became increasingly suspicious of him.
His story was changing almost by the hour. At first, he denied having any knowledge of the missing girl. He didn't know anything about it. But then, slowly, as more details were revealed to him, he said, oh, yes, so I picked her up in my car, but I was a good Samaritan. I was trying to take her home. She was very drunk. But then, as we drove down towards the Oak Road playing fields, she jumped out of my car and ran away.
Detectives arrested Relevich, but still had little evidence to show exactly what happened the night Libby disappeared. So they turned to forensic scientist Nikki Taylor, who began a search for biological traces of Libby.
I went to examine the suspect's house, so my remit was purely looking for areas of blood that may have transferred via his clothing or via his hands, for example, if he'd washed. So we focused on areas such as touch points, so areas that you would touch as you walk around your own home. During our examination, we did find 4 different areas of blood staining. So the police sampled those blood stains at my request, and then we examined them back at the laboratory.
Meanwhile, Nikki and her team examined Relevich's clothing.
Despite extensive work on clothing and other items recovered from his house, and also testing the blood stains found in his property, we didn't find any link to Libby on any of those items.
There was still one more possibility which Nikki thought might reveal evidence: Relevich's car.
Initially, the car was examined by police staff and one of my colleagues, and they took various samples, including tape lifts from the seats. My colleague also examined areas of the car for blood and also for areas that could suggest that a sexual act had occurred in the car. We examined items such as hairs to see whether they could relate to Libby. We also DNA tested areas of the front passenger seat to see if her DNA may have transferred from the lower part of her legs by touching the front of the seat. But everything that we tried, we didn't find any link of Libby to that vehicle.
Detectives still had no forensic evidence to link Relevich to Libby's disappearance. And the search for her continued. Until 7 weeks later, there was an unexpected discovery.
It was on March 20th when a trawler boat was out in the Humber estuary. They spotted what they thought were human remains. An urgent call was put into the local RNLI boat. It came along and confirmed that it was, in fact, a human body in the water.
I was doing the school run, and my phone rang, and it was Sam, our liaison officer, to say that a female's body had been spotted in the Humber. So I said, oh, do you think it's Libby? And she said, well, there aren't any other females missing. I couldn't have lived my whole life not knowing where she was. And I know how fortunate I am, because lots of families don't have that. I had her back. It wasn't the ending to the story that I wanted, but I'd got her back. And that, for me, was incredible, because I just felt, you know, I knew she wouldn't leave me.
Police again called on Nikki Taylor and her team, this time to analyse Libby's remains for forensic evidence to reveal what happened in her final hours.
As Libby had been in the water for so long, we were all expecting this to be challenging. There was an anticipation that there wouldn't really be much that I could add to it.
Sure enough, Nikki could find no remaining evidence of any injuries to Libby.
After an initial examination of the clothing, it was clear that the only damage that was there was really relating to when she'd been pulled out of the water, so that didn't help us to help build a picture for the police.
One final possibility was to search for evidence of a sexual assault. Though after 48 days in the water, This too seemed unlikely.
My examiner, who I was working with at that time, rang me while I was in the office at my desk to say, I found sperm cells on the swabs. And to be honest, I couldn't really believe it. And alongside not really being able to believe it, feeling really excited because this wasn't expected. So to find something tells you that this is a significant finding and could be that key breakthrough in the case that we were hoping for. I think that one of the reasons that we found sperm cells is that the time that Libby had been in the water, it would have been very cold, and therefore that could have preserved the sperm cells and stopped them degrading.
Although cells had been found, there was no guarantee an intact DNA sample could be retrieved.
I had to wait 24 to 48 hours for the DNA result. It was then thinking, right, have I got this right? Are we certain? We check everything, but this one I felt like I really needed to make sure that we were completely certain before I rang the SO, because the finding was that we had DNA matching the suspect.
Police charged Relevitz with the rape and murder of Libby. But there was a problem. The discovery of his DNA was not proof of murder. Relevitz could simply claim he had consensual sex with Libby. Nicky was, however, able to link Relevitz's DNA to a number of other recent sexual offences close to where Libby lived.
A young girl witnessed a male pleasuring himself in public, and he then followed her home and allegedly left some of his body fluids on her front door. When the suspect was interviewed about the alleged incident, he denied this, and he actually stated that he'd been out for a run and he needed to urinate, and she'd seen him urinating. The police had attended that address when it was reported and sampled the swabs. We found that the swabs had sperm cells on them, and when we tested those sperm cells, they matched the suspect.
They also linked his DNA to sexually motivated burglaries and incidents of voyeurism involving other young female students.
Now, what the prosecutors could say to a jury was that this man was a known predator. He was unafraid of scaring young women and pretty brazen in how he was going about it.
Detectives from Humberside Police charged Pavel Relevitz with Libby's murder. And in January 2021, he stood trial at Sheffield Crown Court, where Nicky Taylor's evidence was crucial to the prosecution.
Having worked on the case for a couple of years between when Libby disappeared and when it came to court, I did feel very close to the case, and it felt very important for me to make the findings clear at court.
On the 11th of February 2021, Pavel Relevitz was found guilty of Libby's rape and murder. But he never revealed the secrets of his crimes.
There are some things we will never know about the death of Libby Squire. There was a suggestion about how she might have been killed by the prosecution. There was a suggestion that she might have been suffocated before being dumped in the water, but there was no signs of blunt force trauma. So we will never truly know how she ended up in the river, whether she was chased in there, pushed in there, she was murdered before being thrown in there.
Relevitz was sentenced to life, to serve a minimum of 27 years before being eligible for parole.
This is a case that I think will always stick out for me to some extent, because it was a sad case in many respects, obviously because of the loss of life, but also because of the long, torturous wait for the family. I remember those 7 weeks were a long time, and so it's difficult not to be personally affected by it, and it will always stick with me, I think, throughout my career.
I don't think it's ever been heard of anywhere in the world before that a body submerged in water for 48 days can hold on to, you know, a DNA sample. And because he discarded her body the way he did and threw her in the water, he thought he was being clever. But she was cleverer than him, because she came back.
I think for me, I gained the most professional satisfaction having worked so closely on the case with the police, in both getting that lucky break with the sperm cells, but also building up that historical offending pattern that helped the jury to understand the individual that was committing the crimes.
Everybody in the investigation were amazing. Everything was done with such dignity, with such respect, and everybody wanted the best outcome for Libby. And I felt that they all cared for her and wanted the same for her. They wanted justice for her, you know, so I can't fault any of them. They were amazing.
Forensic soil science is the application of the scientific study of soil. We would test whether there's a potential link between soil that is transferred onto a person or an object and whether that could have come from an identified crime scene.
April 2015, Perth. After being reported missing by his estranged wife, 49-year-old jeweller Alan Gardiner is found dead in his Balbeggie home. Crime scene coordinator Inspector Mark Lorente played a pivotal role during the early stages of the investigation.
She hadn't seen or heard from him for a couple of days, I believe, so obviously she was concerned and called the police. He was forced and then he was found dead on his bed.
Alan had suffered a head injury, his ankles were bound with parcel tape, and he was found wrapped in a quilt. A post-mortem revealed the cause of death.
This was a case of like suffocation, injury to the forehead first and suffocation thereafter. That's obviously indicative of some sort of foul play, like a murder inquiry.
Mark and his team began to investigate Alan's personal life. They spoke to neighbours and friends, including local postman Grant Keane.
He was always quite friendly and he was always telling me about what was going on in his life. One morning, right out of the blue, he just said to me, I'm thinking about taking in a lodger, just so I have a bit of company and it would help me financially as well, he said. And I just said to him, well, watch who you're going to get moved in with you. Make sure you know they're okay, type thing. And he says, oh yeah, I'll be careful, he said.
The lodger Alan ended up renting a room to was Nicola Zulev, a 30-year-old chef working in Perth. But the arrangement quickly turned sour.
I mentioned to Alan, how are you getting on with the lodger? And he just turned around and said to me, not very good at all. And I says, how, what's wrong? And he says, well, he's kind of taken over the house. You think he owns the house rather than me, and plus, I can't get any money out of him. I says, oh my. I says, going, Alan, that's no good at all. And he just said to me, I'm going to have to try and get rid of him. This is no working out at all, he said.
Detectives could find no trace of Zulev, but searches of the property recovered a frying pan with a distinctive marking that closely matched Alan's head injury. The pan was found to contain traces of Zulev's DNA, but it wasn't the breakthrough the investigation hoped for.
The challenge for us forensically is if somebody's got legitimate access to a house, as was this the case with the suspect, we've got to be confident that there's no other legitimate reason for somebody's DNA to be on an item.
Soon, there was another development. Police discovered Alan's car was missing and a media appeal was issued.
So I had people calling in to say they'd seen it in Perth City Centre, and probably the most interesting from my side of the inquiry was I had a member of the public saying they'd seen it in a wooded area a day or two after we reckon Alan was killed.
With DNA evidence having led nowhere, detectives now hope a search of the area may yield evidence to advance the investigation. Mark made his way to the location.
This is the access point where the victim's car was seen by a member of the public after he died, so we're obviously suspicious.
Not far past the tree line, they made a shocking discovery.
This area here was where the shallow grave was dug, a couple of foot deep. You're literally 20 metres from where the car would park. It's not too far to carry a body. And likewise, you're hidden from the nearest house down there by this mound of earth. So again, they obviously thought it was quite a good spot.
Mark's theory was that Zulev drove here to dispose of Alan's remains. His intention being to return sometime later and bury him.
What happened is when the dog hit a water spring, so it was then full of water. We believe that's maybe a reason why he's never actually moved the body to here.
The police now hoped the soil itself could be a source of evidence. Detectives turned to one of the best in this specialised field of expertise, Professor Lorna Dawson.
The soil at this particular site was very fine textured, so it was a clay soil. And you could see that by the spill, the sort of spill material that had been dug up from that hole.
Detectives needed to prove whether this hole was recently dug. If so, that could connect it to Alan's murder. Soil revealed the answer.
Normally, soils have zones, and they are discrete and distinct. But this particular area had been mixed up, so it had recently been disturbed and dug. No more than a day, 2 days, that it had recently been exposed, because that soil was still fresh.
This was confirmation the hole was dug around the time of Alan's murder. And now, a new discovery offered another intriguing clue. Alan's car, and in it, a spade with Zulev's DNA on the handle. But once again, this was evidence that could be explained away.
He could have legitimately used that for doing the garden the week before, could be his defence. So we have to tie in other pieces of evidence.
Luckily, there was also soil on the spade and in the car. Could this be evidence that linked them to the hole in the woods?
I was asked to see if I could look at these items, recover soil from these items, including the vehicle, and see if there was any potential link between those soils and the soils that had been sampled earlier at and around where the hole was located at Balbeggie.
The outside of the vehicle was examined.
The samples on the outside of the vehicle were very mixed in nature, so that after having been at the location, it had likely come into contact with other areas of puddles and clay, so that the samples there were not distinctive for linking to that particular location.
But it was the inside that proved more fruitful.
We found a couple of traces in the footwell mat of the driver's position and also on the driver's pedals. The samples that were recovered from the foot pedals in their analytical characteristics showed that they were consistent with coming from the very surface soil that was on the little pathway to the hole.
Having linked soil on the car's foot pedals to the scene, Lorna next turned to the spade.
The process is to look at those soils for their texture, their consistency and their colours, and compare that to the texture, consistency and colour of the samples, the reference samples, that had been taken previously at the site where the hole had been dug. The soil on the blade of the spade, it shared characteristics of the mineralogy and the organic profile with the soil that was at the base of that hole at the Balbeggie forest. It was much more likely it had come from that hole than anywhere else in that area. The fact that it was a subsoil that transferred to that spade increased the potential link that that person had been and had dug that particular hole.
Lorna could now place Alan's car and the spade at the shallow grave within days of the murder. Police were also learning more about Nikola Zulev. The chef had a dark secret, a £100 a day heroin addiction. And now, an examination of his mobile phone revealed further incriminating evidence.
The suspect's mobile phone, the search history that the suspect was looking at before. So, for example, one of the things he looked at was how dangerous is it to hit a man on the head, and that was the days leading up to the crime. Likewise, we could then look at location of cell site analysis, again, his mobile phone, which would put his mobile phone in the area at the material time being the wooded area, linked with all the other evidence we're starting to piece together.
And as detectives made further inquiries into Zulev, they began to uncover the first clues to a possible motive.
What became evident is that the suspect had been trying to sell Alan's car, as well as some jewellery believed to be from his house, and obviously was desperate for money to feed his drug habit.
A picture had emerged of a hopeless addict in a disintegrating relationship with his landlord.
All the pieces of the jigsaw came together in the end. It showed it wasn't like an accidental injury. A murder, you've got to show a bit of premeditation, which clearly there was. And then the suspect was going to great lengths thereafter to dispose of his body by digging a grave in the forest.
You know, Alan brought him in and trusted him. Alan was just looking for a bit of company and a bit of help with the bills, and Alan obviously trusted him for him to do what he done to Alan. And I just think it's really quite evil what he done to him. And very sad.
In March 2016, Zulev stood trial at the High Court in Livingston. He was found guilty and ordered to serve a minimum of 21 years in jail.
It's never going to bring the victim back, which is a sad thing, and you're always conscious of that massive impact for family and friends. But it's quite rewarding to think that somebody that's been as brutal to do a crime like this is going to be in prison for a long time.
I think the combined information delivered by myself as a forensic soil scientist, it showed that the individual who was on trial had been at that location and had dug that particular hole. One's got to question what other motive, what other reason would someone go at that particular time to dig that particular hole.
The work done by Lorna was quite crucial in this inquiry. It was a unique inquiry in that we had a shallow grave, which you don't often get with murders. But Lorna's work was just part of the big jigsaw puzzle that was absolutely crucial for this on this occasion, I would say.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, police hunting the man behind a vicious acid attack call in an expert witness to help them unravel some extremely puzzling CCTV footage.
Someone who hadn't followed that CCTV around would never equate that individual to the initial attacker.
And after the body of a young woman is found in a field, the Pollen expert is brought in a bid to catch the murderer.
It was then I realised that the field had been ploughed and therefore it didn't have the crop that was there at the time of the murder.
When it comes to CCTV inquiries, we're looking for
any moment whatsoever that could reveal the identification of suspects.
Brighton city centre, the 20th of May, 2021. Sussex police receive a call that a female medical student has been attacked after answering a knock at her front door.
A substance was thrown and the substance landed on her face and on her neck.
Detective Inspector Simon Morgan was the senior investigating officer on the case.
2 police officers attended the scene, and when they approached the address, they could see the door had blistering on it and the floor had a substance on it that was still smouldering. So it looked very, very much like an acid or alkaline attack.
The UK has the highest rate of reported acid attacks in the world. These violent assaults have horrific consequences like those suffered by Adele Bellis. She had acid thrown at her in 2014 while waiting for a bus in Lowestoft, Suffolk.
I was on the phone to my friend when this guy come from behind, and I didn't know if I felt his presence or something in my head just told me to move. So I remember moving my head like this, and yeah, he'd chucked this stuff on me, and you know, I instantly knew it was acid. I just felt I was melting to the ground. As I looked down, the acid was strong enough that it was melted my clothes away. The pain I can't describe. Like, I thought I was dying. I thought I was just going to melt to death. This picture here, this is me before I got attacked. So yeah, I was blonde, highlighted hair. I'd been growing it for my brother's wedding. And then this one is the night of the attack. The acid went so deep that it went past the hair follicles, so half my head hair doesn't grow. And then I lost my ear as well. So you can see that my ear is like basically black, so that's dead. Almost 9 years on, I'm still having treatment to this day.
The victims of acid attacks are most commonly female, and now in Brighton, detectives were investigating another case of a young woman left permanently disfigured when she had sulfuric acid thrown at her.
Acid attacks are extremely serious, which is a GBH level injury, grievous bodily harm, and so the sentence could be life imprisonment in these cases.
Detectives began immediately by gathering information from eyewitnesses.
We did get an account from some of the housemates that a female had come to the door, described as about 5'4", of large build and black in ethnicity. She was wearing a large black coat and had a visor on, because this was the time when we had some COVID restrictions and people were wearing face masks and visors. And so there'd be an area search in the first instance looking for this individual who is quite distinctive.
Local police scoured the area but could find no sign of the distinctive-looking attacker. So detectives turned instead to gathering CCTV footage.
That was our best shot in locating and arresting the suspect in this case.
There were hundreds of CCTV cameras in the area, all owned by different homes and businesses. But it all had to be hunted down and studied quickly. So D.I. Morgan turned to CCTV retrieval and examination expert, Sergeant Alec Barrett.
CCTV largely does have a shelf life. It does expire or get overwritten after a certain point. So we were fighting against time. Literally every minute, every hour that goes by, we're potentially losing CCTV. So it was absolutely crucial that we gained as much as possible at the earliest point to prevent evidence loss. Through conducting inquiries at the location as early on as possible, we identified CCTV at one of the neighbouring houses, which was then used to gain an image of the suspect. And then we've branched out premises to premises, trying to work out whether they have CCTV, get a facial shot or something like that, anything to look to identify that person. We've gathered in the course of the investigation hundreds of hours of CCTV. It's been made into a timeline just showing the suspect's movements around Brighton. So this is fleeing at the location of the offence. However, it became very apparent quite quickly that this wasn't a normal investigation. The next significant hit, if you will, on the suspect was identifying them going underneath Brighton Pier, which at the time was a CCTV black spot, where there's no CCTV. Shortly afterwards, we see someone who appears to be different, but still carrying some of the same items involved, walking up from underneath the pier back onto the upper. There was only one way in and one way out, so we could say for a high level of confidence that the person that went in was the same person that came out.
Detectives were left facing a remarkable conclusion. The suspect wore a disguise, which they removed while out of sight beneath Brighton Pier.
This is a key point within the investigation because the suspect has taken proactive measures to frustrate any police investigation when it comes to CCTV, changing their description so significantly, as well as going to a CCTV black spot to do it.
It's not seen often. Sometimes we may have someone who wears a hood or a balaclava for the very extreme cases, but to have a full disguise, full costume is really unusual.
Alec and his team changed the focus of their CCTV analysis. They were now looking for the same suspect, but with a new appearance.
The person that left the blind spot was now significantly smaller. They appeared a lot more masculine. Because we knew that countermeasures had been employed by the suspect to try and frustrate CCTV efforts, it just made us a lot more, as in even more thorough when it came to checking CCTV. And it was literally from that point that they were last seen, a matter of going premises to premises. As that person walks past the premises, we got that CCTV shown and walked past the premises, and we don't continue on until we've got them on another bit of footage.
Using this meticulous method, Alec and his team tracked the suspect into a department store. Just one use of a debit or credit card could lead detectives straight to him. But they were out of luck.
In this case, the suspect used cash, which limited our ability to trace them financially. This is someone that thought out the offence in quite a detailed way and tried to obfuscate any inquiries.
But the CCTV cameras did capture the suspects moving around the store and buying a new outfit.
The suspect buys a white t-shirt, a blue, black and white jacket and a cream rucksack. Before leaving that store, the suspect changes into that set of clothing, changing his description yet again. The suspect then discards the original blue rucksack into a bin and moves about Brighton, seemingly without a care in the world, enters a fast food restaurant, purchases some food, seemingly just going about his business like he hadn't conducted a grievous attack about an hour previously. Absolutely chilling behaviour.
But the longer the suspect wanders around, the more he is recorded on CCTV. Until, finally, Alec retrieves a vital piece of footage from a kiosk on the seafront.
There he is, right-hand side of the screen. This is the first point where we have got outstanding CCTV showing the suspect's physical characteristics, where he has relaxed his disguises to a certain extent where we can actually see what his true skin colour and physical characteristics are. So between these really good CCTV images that we have, speaking to people that the suspect had spoken to, we could build up a physical, actual descriptive profile of this person, a softly spoken male of Arabic appearance.
Alec was now able to provide detectives with the first clear image of their suspect.
Someone who hadn't followed that CCTV around would never equate that individual to the initial attacker. We needed that CCTV continuity to get to that point.
Not only had Alec and his team painstakingly pieced together this record of the suspect's movements after the attack, but they also found significant footage of him in disguise from earlier that day.
It was almost as if the suspect was trying to be as obvious as possible, showing themselves, this is what I look like, I'm here, look at me.
He went into a local store where he hovered underneath the CCTV camera with his disguise. So it looked quite clearly that he was trying to throw the police off at this very early stage.
It was theorised at the time that the suspect was trying to build up a deliberate CCTV profile of what they looked like when they're heavily disguised, to try and throw off the inevitable police investigation into the movements of that suspect.
But the suspect had not counted on Alec's relentless analysis of CCTV footage. And now D.I. Morgan used the images from the kiosk to definitively identify him.
The CCTV image we had resembled very closely a previous boyfriend of the victim. He was a student doctor in Cardiff, Milad Ralph. And we did approach the victim, and we presented this finding, and she said that they had split up months earlier, but that was amicably. And she hadn't really been in contact with him since.
Ralph became the prime suspect, and after further intelligence checks, D.I. Morgan had enough to charge him. Cardiff police arrested Ralph at a friend's house, where they had also found the clothes he had purchased after the attack in Brighton. A search at his own address turned up another sinister piece of evidence.
In the top drawer of his chest of drawers, they found a folded up piece of paper, which essentially is a shopping list of items to commit this offence. Some of these items are visor, fat suit, top and bottom, a soup mug, which we know was used to contain the acid, and all elements of the disguise that we saw when looking at our CCTV footage. It's quite chilling to see that point 14 on this equipment list was simply listed as formula, which we think was the acid used in the attack. Circumstantial evidence, but it's compelling circumstantial evidence. So this, together with the CCTV, becomes strong evidence for the court.
In August 2021, Milad Ralph was tried for grievous bodily harm. Faced with the weight of evidence against him, he pleaded guilty. The motive for the attack was revenge.
Ralph had split from the victim a few months earlier. He was hurt by that split, and he wanted to punish his ex-girlfriend. And that really was the motive behind this horrendous attack.
Ralph received a sentence of 15 years imprisonment plus 4 years on extended licence. His victim told the court how she is blind in one eye and has been left with damage to the skin on her face and upper body. It's a story all too familiar to acid attack survivor Adele, whose ex-boyfriend had also been responsible for her attack.
I don't think any prison sentence you would be happy with. I think the sentence should be like someone would get for murder, because as simple as a splash, the devastation and the injuries that cause is just crazy, you know. My life will never be the same, but I have to live it, you know.
The painstaking process of knocking on doors to obtain all the CCTV footage was absolutely well worth it. It was really challenging. However, knowing what happened in the first place and why we were even doing it, it just doubled our resolve to catch the person because of the horrific nature of his premeditated, planned crime.
One of the reasons that pollen is so useful in forensic science is that it gets trapped and it persists there. So it can remain as evidence several months or even years later and still be recovered.
June 2010, Leamington Spa. 23-year-old Elzbieta Kinsick is reported missing by her family at the local police station. Local journalist Paul Beard reported on the case.
Elzbieta, who's known to family and friends as Ella, came from Poland originally. When she came to England, she was living with her sister Karina and Karina's partner in Leamington.
Ella had come to the UK to earn money for her husband and young child.
Ella was soon able to form a number of friendships because of the large Polish community in the town. On the 6th of June, Ella was preparing Sunday lunch for her and her sister.
Ella told her sister she was going to meet this man, Piotr Mazalski. He was the partner of a close friend, and Ella said he was looking for relationship advice.
Everyone was under the impression she'd be back within a few minutes because the dinner was still cooking.
But hours later, there was still no sign of Ella, and her anxious family contacted police. Jane Monckton-Smith is a professor of public protection who reviews homicides.
In cases where a woman has been murdered, most of the time that woman is going to know the person that killed her. So though anybody that knows that woman, especially those close to her, they are going to be at the top of the list of suspects.
Mazalski knew Ella well. He said they did meet and that she got into his car.
He said that Ella had told him she got an urgent meeting to go to, and she got out the car and left, and that was the last he saw of her.
But when detectives investigated, they found evidence Mazalski was lying.
Police checked a CCTV camera, and it showed that Ella had got into the car, but no sign of her having got out. When he was shown the CCTV that proved that Ella hadn't got out of the car, he claimed the police had fabricated that. Although he said he didn't know how they were able to do it, he maintained that Ella had got out.
Detectives were now deeply suspicious of Mazalski and looked more closely at his background in Poland. They discovered a long list of violent offences.
When we look at his police record from Poland, we know that he had a history of violence against women, against partners. So he's the kind of almost the perfect candidate for somebody who might commit this type of crime.
However, detectives did not yet have enough evidence to charge Mazalski. He was released on bail, but not before investigators had taken decisive action.
While they were speaking to him, they fitted a tracker device to his car and began to keep him under surveillance.
Police surveillance revealed further suspicious behaviour. He bought a spade, then drove to this field near Chesterton Windmill.
Officers went to the scene where they searched the area and found Ella's body in a field of oilseed rape.
Her body was badly decomposed, but it was immediately clear she had died a violent death.
We're looking at a method, if you like, that was absolutely full of rage. It's been described that she was clubbed to death. It's what we call overkill, so that means there was more violence used than was necessary to merely cause death.
Detectives believed Mazalski had hidden Ella's body in the rape field, then returned there while on bail. But they couldn't prove it, because the tracking device only placed his car close to the field. It did not place him at the actual crime scene. Due to the decomposition, no DNA evidence could be found. So detectives turned to forensic palynologist Tony Brown.
The police actually provided me with quite a lot of material. They provided me with botanical remains strewn across the road. They provided me with material from the footwells of the suspect's car. They also gave me the suspect's socks and also his tracksuit bottoms.
Tony's first task was to visit the deposition site.
When I visited the site, the police took me to where they believed the car had been parked, and in fact you could still see the tyre marks where it had been parked on the verge. And then they took me to the verge by the field, and it was then I realised that the field had been ploughed, and therefore it didn't have the crop that was there at the time of the murder.
It was a setback, but Tony remained convinced Pollen could crack the case.
There were some areas at the edge of the ploughing, which was the original surface. So I could take control samples in the field and at the edge of the field and on the verge. We match our samples against control samples. And the stronger the match, the more likely are that the forensic sample came from the same place as your control sample.
Tony began examining the composition of his control samples.
There was an old-growth hedge which had oak and also had hawthorn and sloe, but there was also a crop residue which was clearly oilseed rape. There was also clear evidence of cleavers, and that had grown all over the fence, which was the only entrance point to the field. And also there was still stinging nettles all around the entrance.
Tony now compared these pollen profiles to the profiles recovered from Mazolski's car and clothing.
He was wearing sandals which had an open back and rather woolly socks, and the result of this is that his socks accumulated a vast amount of both pollen and even little bits, macroscopic parts of plants. Under the scanning electron microscope, there are details which means that we can be confident that this was oilseed rape. So we had large amounts of oilseed rape, both on his shoes, on the trousers, and in one of the footwells that was, of course, in the control samples of the field.
It was proof Mazolski entered a rape field, but there were dozens such fields nearby. Tony needed to show he entered the same field where Ella's body was found. Once again, pollen held the key.
He had evidence from both the macroscopic remains and from the pollen that he'd walked across the road, crossed a fence which was covered in cleavers, walked through some nettles, into the field, walked along the side of the field and then out into the oilseed rape. And then presumably had retraced his steps, leaving material on the way before he got back into the car and drove off.
But just being in the field wasn't enough. Tony needed to try and place Mazolski deep in the field where Elżbieta had been found. He decided to look at the concentration of pollen on Mazolski, which should be around 70 to 80% if he had been there.
We also could see that when we looked at the control samples, that he probably went out about 20, 30 metres or so from the hedge. And in this case, our control samples told us that we should get about 70, 80% of crop at that distance away from the hedge. And that confirmed with roughly what he had on his socks and tracksuits.
This proved not just that Mazolski had been on the edge of the field, but in towards the middle where Elżbieta had been found. It was proof Mazolski walked to the very part of the field where Ella's body was found. Detectives could now charge him with murder. In 2011, he faced trial at Warwick Crown Court.
It is unlikely that a jury is going to accept that totally by chance he would pick the exact same spot, cross the road in the same place, cross the fence in the same place, walk partly along the side of a field and then into a field which just happened by accident to be the one field that Ella had been murdered in. I don't think any jury is going to accept that as a credible coincidence.
Sure enough, the jury was not convinced, and in a little over 4 hours, they found him guilty. He was sentenced to a minimum of 32 years in prison.
That is a really, really serious sentence. The judge really did see the seriousness and the cold-blooded nature of this crime.
Of course, the greatest impact of Ella's death was on her partner back in Poland, who hadn't been able to say goodbye to her properly.
There was no DNA of the suspect on the deceased's body because of the high degree of decomposition during the summer before the body was found. So therefore, this was basically the major element of the circumstantial evidence in the case.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Knowing when someone's done something is one thing, but proving it's completely different. We need that last piece of the jigsaw.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
It might be a fingerprint, footwear mark, cell site analysis that can come up with that golden ticket to put that investigation on a different path.
Using the very latest techniques.
Several months or even years later, evidence can remain and still be recovered.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
The forensics in this case showed us what did happen. Not what could have happened, what did happen.
You've been in the scene. It's virtually impossible to clean everything up. Something is going to be there. If we're looking in the right place, we'll find it.
Without the unseen heroes painstakingly going through forensic bits, I might not have got justice for my daughter.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, a blood pattern analyst searches for evidence of a serious miscarriage of justice.
When I first received the reports that were available, I read them, and it all focused around the apartment and the immediate outside of the apartment. And it was kind of like, are we missing a trick here?
And a forensic expert in mobile phone analysis is brought in to help a child escape a drug gang in a landmark case.
If we can identify who is sending those messages and attribute that phone to an individual, we learn who is controlling that child and exploiting them for their own financial gain.
Bloodstain pattern analysis is basically looking at the distribution of bloodstains and trying to provide some form of narrative as to how they were created and under what circumstances they were created. And by doing that, they can provide a really meaningful part of the picture in forensic science investigation.
The 23rd of August 2016, Wood Green, North London. 4 Polish men spend the evening drinking in this ground floor flat. In the early hours of the morning, police are called to the area. One of the men, Grzegorz Patriski, has been attacked and has bled to death. Officers find his body in an alleyway 60 meters away. Patriski's 3 companions were all charged with his murder. Barrister Siobhan Gray was tasked with defending one of them, Mr. Patrick Paheska.
The prosecution's case was that there were 4 men in a room and one of those men ends up dead. When the police arrived, they followed droplets of blood to the house. And in the house, in that room, there was lots of blood on the wall, and blood on the floor and on the bed. And so they concluded that the attack had happened in there.
Detectives assumed the badly injured victim then fled the flat before he collapsed and died. And they believed CCTV showed 2 of his attackers, Paheska and Grzegorz Shell, running from the scene of the crime.
They relied on the CCTV showing that they were leaving the house after the attack. Once it had finished, it was all over and done with. That was the picture.
Siobhan's client painted a different picture. He said he fled the scene with Grzegorz Shell after the other man in the room began to attack the victim.
But at first blush, it really did look like there was quite significant evidence against him. He lied to the police in an interview saying that he wasn't in the house at the time of the incident or even when it started. that he didn't recognise the man on CCTV as being him. And the prosecution were able to adduce before the jury his previous convictions for violence, and so it built what appeared to be a strong case.
In December 2017, all 3 men who had been at the flats with the victim were tried by jury. Peheska and Shell were found guilty of murder.
We went to see Patrick Peheska in the cells after the verdict was announced, and he was in shock. Of course, we were going to mount an appeal, but it's very difficult to overturn a murder conviction. There has to be something, compelling to demonstrate that the trial was not a fair trial.
Help came from Polish investigative journalists who uncovered evidence that the jury in this case had been misled regarding the other man who had been charged.
The prosecution had been informed by the Polish authorities that this other man was a man of good character, when in fact it turned out to be the case that this other man had a history himself. The Court of Appeal quashed the convictions for murder on the basis of the fresh evidence obtained by the journalist from Poland, and the court ordering a retrial allowed us to go back and look again at the scientific forensic evidence and the pathology.
Siobhan sought help from a charity called Inside Justice, who specialise in assisting with cases of wrongful convictions. Sitting on their advisory panel was Joe Millington, a forensic scientist with a specialism in blood pattern analysis. Straight away, she spotted a hole in the investigation.
When I first received the reports that were available, I read them, and it all focused around the apartment and the outside, the immediate outside of the apartment. And there was no conversation, really, about the rest of the blood, the street, the area where the deceased had ultimately been found. And it was kind of like, are we missing a trick here? The scientists that were asked to attend the crime scene, they were called with a very specific remit. Please look inside that apartment and tell me what you find. We think it's the attack site. When we were asked to review the evidence, we're being asked, where do you think the assault took place? And that includes inside, and it includes outside. And you can see that you have much more freedom in thinking about the case when you're asked an open question. And so it became evident that we needed to review it all very holistically and try and understand whether or not those assumptions that had been made were correct.
As part of this holistic approach to the review, the team also asked Professor Jack Crane, ex-States pathologist for Northern Ireland, to re-examine the findings of the original post-mortem.
The information I was provided with is that the fatal injury was inflicted inside the flat, and my interest was to look at that and see, well, is that credible? Is that how it happened? Or are there any other possible explanations?
The original pathologist had made detailed notes of the injuries found on the victim.
He had sustained a number of injuries. There were 2 long incisions to his scalp, to the back of the scalp, and those wounds in themselves would have bled significantly. There was an incision on the right side of his neck, 2 wounds to the back of his shoulder, and there was a defensive wound to his arm, probably where he had put his arm up to protect himself. The critical injury, of course, was the injury to the neck where a knife or a bladed weapon of some sort had penetrated the left side of the neck and had gone across the neck and had gone through the carotid artery, which is one of the main arteries supplying blood to the brain. But if you damage your carotid artery, you will get torrential bleeding from that. And looking at the scene, I was not convinced that there was enough blood there to account for the carotid artery injury. I just did not think there was enough.
Jo Millington was also beginning to doubt the accepted version of events as she reviewed crime scene photos in more detail.
So here we've got contact or transfer bloodstains on the wall, and within it there are marks that are indicative of hair that's come into contact with that blood before it's dried. When you take that into consideration with the pathology evidence, the cuts to his head, you know, they would bleed profusely, according to the medical experts. So the majority, if not all of this blood, could potentially be from those severe head injuries.
But for Joe, there was nothing in the pattern of blood staining inside the flat to suggest that this was where Patrisky received the fatal stab wound to his neck.
And that was really important because it then allowed us to say, OK, well, this could all be from the head, we accept that, but now we definitely need to look at the blood that's available elsewhere to see whether or not there's anything in that that's telling us a story as well.
Before they could make sense of the blood patterns outside, the team gathered information about the known movements of the 4 men on the night of the attack.
It's a ground floor flat with a large bay window with a basement area. And in fact, it was quite well known that occupants of that property used the bay window to get in and out of it because it led directly onto the steps that took them up to the main door. And on the night of the murder, people were leaving and entering the flat through this bay window, and it included the deceased after he'd sustained injuries.
CCTV evidence showed that the victim left the flat after the attack. The original investigation assumed that the presence of bloodstains inside proved that, at this point, he had already received the fatal wound to his carotid artery. Professor Crane had doubts.
Allegedly having sustained this injury to one of the most vital structures supplying blood to the brain, he was able to get onto a settee, open a window, get out onto a window ledge, jump onto a set of steps, and then run a distance of 60 yards before he eventually collapsed. My assessment was that with a carotid artery injury, you're not going to be able to do that.
Joe Millington was also convinced the victim received his fatal knife wound outside. But she wanted to go one step further and pinpoint exactly where that happened. So she turned to the pattern of bloodstains on the street.
We can use the blood patterns to effectively track out and reconstruct the last moments of his life. And the blood trail travels along this pavement area. Now, along this street, there is a parked car, and you can start to see that behind it, we've got this kind of collection of blood, and it's starting to run towards the curb because of the camber of the road. And this is indicative of the victim having paused here and probably tucked in behind the car in order to hide from his assailant. And that would then explain why we've got this kind of increase in amount of blood there, because his injuries are bleeding. Now, beyond this point, the blood starts to increase substantially. So we could infer from the blood patterns that the victim has sustained a very significant injury at this point. He now takes a right turn into Glendale Avenue, and there's a small alleyway, and that alleyway, in terms of the blood staining, we can see that there is now really substantial blood loss.
The findings of both blood pattern analysis and pathology now all pointed to one conclusion.
The consensus of opinion across the pathologists and the scientists was that the fatal injury, the one to the neck, had been sustained when the victim had left the flat and had travelled beyond the parked car.
This revelation changed entirely the significance of the CCTV footage which showed Paheska and Shal running from the scene.
The CCTV evidence was used by the prosecution in the first trial to show to the jury that, well, here's Mr. Paheska and here's Mr. Shal running out of the house in the middle of the night after the attack. Job done, it's all over, and the killers are making good their escape. In the retrial, the CCTV evidence was used to demonstrate that Mr. Paheska and Mr. Shaw were not involved in the killing because the fatal wound took place around the corner from the house at a time when Mr. Paheska and Mr. Shaw were 2 or 3 streets away in the opposite direction.
The evidence presented by Joe Millington and Jack Crane convinced the court. 4 years after Paheska and Shell were convicted and sent to prison for the murder of Grzegorz Petryski, their retrial at last found them innocent.
When the verdict was announced, Patrick Paheska broke down in tears, but that was the relief. He had been believed that he was right and that he was telling the truth. And just the pain of being away from his family and the years that he had lost with them. Patrick Paheska got his life back, and there's no question that the defining point in that trial was the pathology and scientific forensic evidence.
Quite clearly, this was a serious miscarriage of justice, but it demonstrates how perhaps small little bits of information can get distorted. The assumption that the murder took place in the flat was perpetuated throughout the whole investigation, and it was never challenged, it was never looked at critically. And if you don't do that, then there remains the possibility that something like this could happen again.
I have to say that it was a case that was a real relief, because I know the energy and dedication that everyone else had put in this case, that they'd really put their kind of faith in the system righting itself. You know, I think because it was so clear-cut that the people who had been found guilty of this murder were innocent.
Cell site analysis is using the call data records for a mobile phone to give a general location of where that phone was at certain times in an investigation.
October 2020, Eastbourne. At the local train station, police arrest a 16-year-old boy on suspicion of being concerned in the supply of Class A drugs, but quickly realise they have uncovered a much bigger crime. Detective Superintendent Gareth Williams runs a local anti-drugs task force and remembers the case well.
This individual rose suspicions of the officers. He was searched. He was in possession of a small amount of cash and a mobile phone that we think was involved again in supplying drugs.
The boy's age, scruffy appearance, and his mobile phone all led Transport Police to suspect he was part of a drug-dealing operation known as County Lines, and, in fact, an innocent victim.
County Lines is a business model which uses mobile phone technology to supply drugs to a client base. The county line is actually the phone handset, which is the centre for all the business, and that is how the business is conducted.
These gangs sometimes use the public transport system to move dealers and drugs around Britain. Gareth is part of British Transport Police's County Lines Task Force, who focus on bringing down these gangs.
Intelligence showed us that there were county lines that were active in the town, as there are along many locations on the south coast.
Children, like the boy arrested in Eastbourne, are often forced to deal drugs on behalf of gangs.
We do deal with a disproportionate amount of children compared to other police forces, and so they look at behaviours amongst young people that they encounter on the railway network and at set locations.
Amanda Radley works with the police to improve the safeguarding response to county lines.
We know that children that are being exploited are vulnerable. They will be hugely at risk in terms of both their emotional, physical, psychological well-being, in terms of the risk posed to them.
Detectives believed the boy was the victim of child slavery, forced to sell drugs against his will. The mobile phone officers seized when they arrested him now promised to reveal crucial evidence about who was controlling him.
That phone will contain data on it, such as messages, and those messages will be sent by a variety of parties, but there should be some numbers on there that feature very strongly. If we can identify who is sending those messages and attribute that phone to an individual, we learn who is controlling that child and exploiting them for their own financial gain.
Officers searched the boy's phone.
Our initial analysis helped us identify one specific number that was of importance to us, and that's the number that we referred to from that point forward as 1770, which are the last 4 digits of that number. We identified that this 1770 number was actually suspected to be a county line that was called Blue. We saw evidence of heroin and crack cocaine being offered for sale within those messages, so it was clear that the child's phone was receiving bulk messages, the broad messages that are sent out to advertise drugs for sale. But also within there was a text that said, "Come grab this pack," which led us to understand very clearly that this child was being exploited and being used within a county line.
Police soon realised this boy was a significant link to a larger investigation into county lines operations, which had already led to 3 arrests in Hastings.
We identified that the 3 men that had been arrested were a man called Cargbo, a man called Farousa, and a man called French. Cargbo had some slips of paper with the phone number of Blue written on it, as if to advertise the county line. Farousa had a small amount of heroin and crack cocaine on his person, and French had a top-up voucher from a newsagent for the phone 1770.
This was the phone used to send text messages to the boy arrested in Eastbourne. Now, a search of Cargbo's home revealed more links between the men and the boy.
Sussex police recovered somewhere in the region of 20 phone handsets, some of which had been used with the 1770 SIM card.
Police had the suspected county line's phones and the phone the boy had been using. But now they needed to show the gang leaders had been controlling the boy. They called on expert witness and cell sites analyst Paul Hope. Paul began trying to link the content of the phone's text messages to the boy's movements.
I had to look at not only the movement of the victim's mobile phone, but also the cause of that movement. We had to look at the text messages and the time of those text messages and see, did the content of that text message make the victim move from one location to another, in which case that would be that he was under instruction and therefore would assist in the case of modern slavery.
Paul then examined the phone's locations when text messages were sent.
We took the text messages which had been recorded here from both the Blue Line data and the victim's data, and we transferred that onto a map which shows that all of these text messages were being made in the Hastings area.
Detectives knew the boy travelled by train from Hastings to Eastbourne. Now, Paul needed to prove whether his journey was made because of a text sent by the drug gang from the phone known as Blue. One conversation in particular proved crucial.
So as we go through, we can see a conversation taking place between the Blue Line and the victim. And this one's quite crucial because at 29 seconds past 9, the victim is saying, "I'm on my way to the station." The Blue Line is now asking the victim if he knows any yards in EA. And I believe that to be, do you know anywhere where you'll be able to deal drugs in Eastbourne? The victim comes back saying he doesn't. We get the crucial message from the Blue Line at 9:37:16 saying, "You know about Devonshire Park." The victim says, "Near the theatre." Yeah. And that was the crucial link, because not only is the Blue Line asking the victim to go to Eastbourne to deal drugs, but he's also pointing out you need to go to the yard near to the Devonshire Theatre because that's where he wants him to deal the drugs from.
Paul had uncovered that the gang was instructing the boy. He next needed to establish that the boy actually did what the gang had said.
We then took the data for the victim's phone from the point when the text message is finished to noon or around noon on the 13th of October. You can see that the victim's phone moves from the Hastings area and moves generally west down towards Eastbourne, following a route that is consistent with the rail network. If we then look at the cell usage, which is within the Eastbourne area, you can see that certainly at noon and prior to it, the victim's phone is in the Eastbourne area, and more specifically in an area that includes the Devonshire Theatre.
The phone data revealed the teenager was shuttling by train between Eastbourne and Farousa's address in Hastings. Each time he arrived in Eastbourne, a broadcast message would be sent to hundreds of recipients from the Blue County line advertising the sale of heroin and crack cocaine. Paul could now show the boy was a victim of modern slavery and being controlled by the County Line's gang.
Paul was able to pull connections together, co-locate phones, produce a really detailed report which wasn't challenged. And that degree of independence and his accreditation, of course, goes a long way in court and leads to much better evidence being provided.
In February 2022, at Brighton Crown Court, all three men pleaded guilty to supplying Class A drugs, with Cargbo and Farousa also pleading guilty to human trafficking of a child. French was sentenced to 2 years suspended. Cargbo got 4 years and 9 months in prison, Farousa 3 years and 11 months, and both received a 5-year slavery and trafficking prevention order. The 16-year-old was rescued from the control of the gang.
So for this child, they were moved out of the area to a place of safety. They were offered some additional support in terms of enabling them to potentially reflect on what had happened to them so that they could start leading more of a normal lifestyle that a child would want for any child in this country to be living.
This was a really important case for British Transport Police and for the task force that I oversee. These were our first convictions for human trafficking under the Modern Slavery Act and our very first slavery and trafficking prevention orders. So it's a landmark case for us.
It was an interesting case. It's the first time I've had to merge text content into cell site analysis in that way. And I was quite pleased and proud with the way I'd done it, and I'd probably do it that way again if I got the chance.